Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Friday Australia at Home, our last one for the week in our, I think, third week now. I want to start by acknowledging our First Nations people. I'm hosting this from Gadigal land. I know that many of you are spread right across right across our lands here and on all sorts of different places. I think that's important to do generally because there is so much more we can do to acknowledge and improve the lives of our First Nations people, but especially in the context of this conversation where we're going to be talking a lot about food and our continent's ability to produce it, sustain us, and the consequences of that, where I think they have a lot to contribute. So I think just to start with, my name is Daniel Stone. I work at a company called Principleco that does a lot of advocacy work and with us, we've got three great speakers who I'll introduce in just a moment. But first, I want to give you a quick roundup of Australia at Home. I know many of you have joined us for sessions like this before, so I'll keep it a bit shorter than usual. Basically, there's a number of different partner organisations, including Principle, The Guardian, Centre for Australian Progress, Essential Media, the Community Council of Australia, and the Australian Climate Foundation, who thought that in these kind of odd and difficult times, it was important to find a place to bring us all together and to think about things that are a bit bigger, a bit broader, and a bit more consequential than the kind of immediate anxiety that a lot of the COVID discussions were manifesting in. So that's what Australia at Home is. It's a place to come together and think about bigger ideas over a longer period of time. Just as some ground rules before we get things underway, we're recording this session to share later. Lots of people who weren't able to join us today have asked if they can watch it, so just let us know if that's a problem for you. You can message Hannah, who is in our Slack channel, as our tech supporter. Additionally, if you're having any challenges with any of the audio or video, you can let her know as well. We will keep people on mute just as we have the conversation underway. But we do really want to kind of elevate everyone who has joined us and give you a chance to kind of step forward and speak, to ask a question, to participate in the discussion. So we do have a chat function there as well. So please put your questions, thoughts, and ideas in there. If they're just little things, we'll write right back to you and just say, oh, it's this, it's that. But also if you've got a bigger conceptual question, please pop it in there and we'll kind of put that to the speakers as well. We also really encourage you to leave your video on. If you haven't got it on gallery mode, I encourage you to do that now. It's just the little dots up in the top right-hand corner of your screen. It means that you can see all the different people that have come to join us. So we've got about 120 people in the room at the moment. And I think, at least for me, I haven't been able to see too many people in the flesh. So it's nice just to see that you're with all these different other people and who they are and where they're coming from. So yeah, please do leave your video on if you have it. It's just a nice way of connecting. So our speakers today are really interesting people. We're going to be talking about food in the time of COVID. It's a broad kind of scope. And I think it's interesting because we're all spending a lot more time indoors and a lot more time on groceries than perhaps we have in the past. Spending at supermarkets has increased by 15% each week compared to a normal week. Alcohol spending is up 33%, and food delivery is up a whopping, but perhaps unsurprising, 65%. Enormous changes in the way we spend our money and the way we get and consume our food. There's millions of Australians, though, are still experiencing food insecurity, and in some ways this current context has made that much more acute. A number of food production processors, businesses, and the people who are part of our food production chain are also struggling to catch up with what is a pretty significant change in expectations, in demand, and in their ability to supply that demand. And also, aside from the kind of policy mechanical issues, a lot of us have started eating differently. I don't know about you, but I've certainly started snacking a little bit to pass the time when I'm at home. And I think what we eat now can have huge consequences on our long-term health. So lots of different ways that food is changing or impacting on how we live our lives at the moment that is a bit different to how it's always been. So without any further ado, we're going to hear from our folk about what's been happening, what it means, and what we can do about it. I'm going to start by introducing everyone one by one and asking you all the same question I've asked all of our guests so far. So to start with, I want to introduce John Robertson, who's the Executive General Manager of Food Bank New South Wales and the former Opposition Leader of New South Wales, and say, John, how are you feeling? How are you going?
Hi, Daniel. Yeah, going all right. It's, I mean, from a food bank perspective, very busy, but for me personally, I think slowly adjusting to the notion of not seeing your kids and grandkids, like so many. I think it's quite an interesting period of time, and I'm settling in, doing the sort of work from home and also in at the warehouse every second day is creating some challenges. But look, by and large, I think like most people, just sucking it up and accepting that it's for the greater good. And I think, the figures that we're seeing out at the moment for Australia show that what we're all doing and going through so far seems to be working quite effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all feeling a lot more encouraged than we were a few weeks ago. Next, I want to introduce Rebecca Huntley, who's a social researcher who's written a number of books on food, including Eating Between the Lines. So, Rebecca, how are you feeling? How are you going?
Oh, look, all you have to do is review the international news and national news, and it stops you feeling any kind of sense of self-pity. But I am at home with 3 children working on my own, so I want to blow my brains out.
I can have a lot of empathy for you on that. Lastly, Elly Howse, who's a public health researcher with the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre, who focuses on the prevention of chronic disease. How are you feeling?
I am feeling actually quite hungry because I realised it's 1 o'clock and I haven't eaten lunch yet. So I'm sure by the end of this, I'll be feeling even hungrier.
I can imagine. So you can always get some Uber Eats to just slide in like they do in the ads while we're chatting. I'll start with John. What do you think is the biggest or most unexpected impact COVID will have on how we approach eating?
So I think, Daniel, the thing that struck me early on in the piece has been the fact that we deal with people at Food Bank who live with food insecurity every day. And what we're now seeing, which I think is sad on a whole lot of levels, but people who've never lived with food insecurity for the first time actually having to confront that, and that realisation of just how hard it is to survive if you don't have enough income to put food on the table. And so for me, I think it's going to be one of those things that a lot of people will take away, whenever life goes back to normal, whatever that looks like. There'll be people who would never have expected in their life they would have experienced food insecurity, suddenly having to confront that. And I'm hopeful that will change people's views about what food insecurity looks like in Australia, because for Food Bank, and Rebecca and I have discussed this over many years, what we see, and we do a survey every year, is that about half of the people that we're now providing food to through our charity network are people who work either casual, part-time and underemployed, or in the gig economy. There were a lot of people, I think, used to struggle with the notion of how can that be in the so-called lucky country. I'm hopeful, on the back of this, that I think the difficulties that people are going, that something positive will come out of it, and that is that people realise that while we have been the lucky country for so long, there was a significant cohort that weren't fortunate enough to find themselves in that circumstance. And perhaps people will think a bit differently about how we judge people who are looking for food relief and support.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess specifically on that, obviously there was a big period where right when COVID anxiety was really kind of starting to spread, I guess, as the disease was, a lot of folks started hoarding or panic buying and changing the way they actually collect groceries. What kind of impact did that have on Food Bank?
Well, two. I mean, one is firstly the people that are often just getting by don't have money to hoard, so they're going to the supermarkets just to shop as we normally would on a weekly basis, and they're missing out. And secondly, for us, because of that hoarding, food that was being donated to Food Bank was suddenly disappearing, because we watched our amount of produce that was donated drop by about 40% almost overnight, which meant, and that was largely because the supermarkets wanted to make sure they had fresh fruit and vegetables on the shelves, so they dropped their standards to make sure it was there, and as a result of that, we were missing out. We've been unable to secure some what you might call key staples even now as a result of that hoarding, and what it's done is it's exposed how stretched our supply chains can get when you see these sorts of effects. And whether you can afford to go and shop in the supermarket or whether you're relying on Food Bank for food, it's really highlighted the fact that in the middle of a crisis that goes beyond state borders and beyond even national borders, how difficult it can be with the supply chains.
And do you want to actually tell us a little bit about how Food Bank gets its food? Because I think that's really interesting in the context of that.
So Food Bank's been around for 28 years in Australia. We're part of the global food banking network out of the US. We get our food donated through farmers or out of Sydney markets at Flemington. We have donations from the food and grocery manufacturers, and we take product that's close to or past best before, because it's simply a guide as to quality of food, but we insist we get guidance as to how long that food is fit for human consumption. And we also purchase food because, sadly, despite the generosity that we've seen over the years, we don't get enough through donations of food to feed people in need. So we purchase food. And what we're now seeing in these times is that the people we would normally purchase from are prioritising the major retailers, as you'd expect if you're a business. But also we import some food. And what we've seen is that some of those imports are now some countries are stopping imports of food. And that's having an impact on what we provide in terms of key staples. The one thing I would say is, and I think it's really important because people like to sensationalise this thing about will Australia run out of food? The answer is no. We'll always have enough food because we export so much. But we won't have, I don't think, the diversity of choice that we've had previously around things like rice, pasta, and some of those processed foods that are what we would classify as key staples. And that's largely because most of it's manufactured overseas, and those countries at the moment are looking after their own. So when it comes to rice, as an example, because of the drought, there is no rice crop in Australia this year. We have then sought to import rice out of Vietnam and Thailand, and we're not having the same success that we would have previously had. That's not to say the retailers won't have that success, but certainly from where we sit in the scheme of things, we're not being able to, at this point, access those sorts of products, and that's going to impact.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think something we don't think about a lot. And actually, it brings up a broader concept. And if Rebecca or Elly have things they want to chip into this as well after John responds, please do, because I know you both have a lot of insight here too. But I know that this week, Chris Brooks, the head of the Southern Riverina Irrigators, triggered a bunch of anxiety by talking about how Australia might run out of rice and wheat entirely. That's something that this debate seems to have gone backwards and forwards within the community over the last couple of weeks, which is how secure is our food supply. As I understand it, actually Australia produces 93% of the food we actually eat each year, so we should actually be quite resilient. But there are big gaps, as you kind of have mentioned there, where some staples are actually really hard to acquire. So I guess my question is, do you think that that's a valid worry? How do you think that'll play out?
So when it comes to rice, rice is Australia a drought issue. It's just one of those things that with drought and no water, you can't grow rice. We export more than we eat. So I don't think, and as I said at the outset, I don't think we should get concerned about we're going to run out of food. I think it might just be that we're limited as to what sort of foods that we get access to. But no one's going to go hungry in Australia simply because we've run out of food. There's a whole range of other reasons why they might, but it won't be because we run out of food.
Yeah. Oh, Elly, I think you might be on mute.
I thought I was unmuting myself. I think one thing to also kind of note about this sort of concept of running out of food, and this kind of applies not just in Australia, but also globally too, is the world actually produces enough food for its inhabitants. It's just that it's inequitably distributed within countries and then between countries as well. So, I think that's definitely something to think about for the future when we think about kind of longer term issues like climate change, which we know the drought currently has been really influenced by those sort of changes in climate too. So it's not so much the actual, do we produce enough food? It's how are we distributing it? Is it in an equitable and fair way?
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I think on that, I might actually turn to Rebecca now and say, what have you been observing? I know you have a different but very aligned perspective on this whole area. Is there anything unexpected or unusual or remarkable that you have noticed happening within the food ecosystem, and how do you think will impact things?
I suppose food has always interested me because I think the way that we produce and consume food and talk about it is really reflective of what's going on in our broader society. So social inequality, how the economy is structured, and kind of you know, key cultural values and traits of our community. And so the work that I've done in the past has really sought to show how particularly social inequality is manifest in all of that kind of from field to fork process in terms of how we produce food and how we consume it. And so what's all I've really observed is that in a pandemic that it can increase and become really kind of visible to people about who are the winners and losers in our food system. So one of the things, you know, so just some examples are very clear. I mean, I said a couple of weeks ago that, you know, and the point you made about food deliveries going up. I mean, we know that that companies that that negotiate the kind of go-between from the businesses that produce the food to the people who deliver it to people are making a pretty massive profit from that whole process. And the delivery drivers themselves are not necessarily particularly well paid or in particularly good, you know, economic or industrial situation in terms of the work that they do. And so it really highlights that in a situation like this where you've got this kind of increased demand for food delivery, you don't necessarily get increased benefit for the people who are kind of delivering that food necessarily. Not a particularly highly unionised part of the industry. But I would say that they're an essential service, not necessarily as essential as nurses, but pretty essential to people who may not be able to constantly go out and get their own food. I think we've seen too the role that supermarkets play and their corporate responsibility, particularly to vulnerable consumers, is particularly important. They're a little bit slow on the uptake in terms of working out that there was going to be a run on things like toilet paper, but also on a run on things like pasta and rice and various other kinds of things that a lot of low-income families really depend on in terms of making sure that they structure a meal around that. So the corporate responsibility of supermarkets has been highlighted by this whole situation. The issue in terms of access and choice for rural and regional consumers of food has also been highlighted. I mean, there was some, I wouldn't say apocryphal, but there were stories about people kind of going to regional towns and kind of stripping the supermarkets and taking stuff away from there, and what that means for those communities that don't necessarily have an enormous amount of options in terms of, you know, access to food. So I think that what this has done is highlighted and exacerbated those inequalities in the system, hopefully enough to make us realise that as we go through the long economic tail of this, and there is going to be, you know, where the epidemiology is looking good, but the economic indicators long-term means not necessarily that there's going to be a continuation of hoarding, but all of those social inequalities around food production, food consumption, that John deals with day to day, are going to continue. I mean, and I suppose you compare that to the very kind of the somewhat, I think, problematic view that this is a great opportunity for us to stay at home, bake banana bread, and, you know, share it on Instagram. So I'm sure there's a small part of the community that's doing that, but I think that makes that kind of, even in an affluent society like Australia, where there's still significant pockets of inequality, I think we should be really focusing on the economic reconstruction that will need to happen out of this, and how we make sure that the kinds of inequalities that existed before here aren't exacerbated, that we actually find a way to address them.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to wonder if there's been a run on sourdough starter as well. I feel like
yeah, absolutely. Sourdough starter and hair dye are the last kinds of things that are going to hopefully will recover before those two horrible things happen.
Yes. I might actually ask Lara Watson to step forward and pose a question, which I thought was built off, and just while we're unmuting her, which builds off your point, Rebecca, about delivery drivers,
yes,
but turns it towards regional communities. So,
yes.
Lara, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Thank you. I work in remote communities looking after CDP workers. I oversee the First Nation Workers Alliance. And one of the issues that are being raised with us in remote communities that already have premium prices on fresh food and groceries, what we are seeing is even further price hikes. So like $25 for some toilet paper, but also a food shortage.
Yeah.
And my question is, how do we actually raise this more broadly to address it? And how do we stop this exploitation from happening?
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? So, I mean, I wonder if, John, given your experience in rural regional communities with Food Bank in New South Wales, might be able to address that better than I.
So one of the things that we're doing regularly is building a network of charities. So we don't do frontline. We work with 750 charities and about 280 schools across the state, and Food Bank exists in every state. We also deal a lot with some of the Aboriginal land councils. I've been liaising with ABSEC about some of those remote communities and just how we might start to get food into some of those areas that are significantly disadvantaged as a result of this. The government, I mean, to be fair, the government's been pretty generous with funding going forward. And I think that helps us and puts us in a strong position to make sure we're looking after those communities in particular, given A, the level of disadvantage, and B, just the fact that they're being isolated more so than the rest of the community from a health perspective. So we're making sure that we're focused on finding channels to get that food in there. Our issue isn't going to be getting it there, it's the distribution network once it gets there and making sure we've got that capacity on the ground to deliver, and hence talking to ABSEC and also the land councils.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that unlike all of the internet-based things, which are still hugely problematic, I think a lot of people forget that we still need to move food, and that has. And
to be honest, I mean, Rebecca's right. I mean, what this has shown is the people we normally hold up as the heroes and the key workers, and some of those are still the case in the health sector, but elsewhere, I think teachers, people in warehouses, in those manufacturing sectors, in the transport industry, the people who are sometimes just seen as the others in the workforce, what this has shown is, in fact, these people are key to keeping ourselves going, keeping ourselves fed, trying to maintain some semblance of normality. And it's to my earlier point, what I hope out of all this is that people suddenly realise that, a truck driver isn't just a truck driver, or a train driver or a bus driver or someone who works in a supermarket isn't just someone that's there. They're actually a key part of what holds our society together, which allows us to function with some semblance of normality in what is far from a normal set of circumstances that we're all living with. And I think that's going to be the challenge for all of us. Everyone keeps talking about the world's not going to be the same when we come out the other side of this. The real challenge is that we all remember that we don't get 6 months down the track and all revert back to business as usual, but we remember. I'm hopeful that people will remember this for the good and the bad, but take away a lot of the positives out of it, that we remember that we all rely on each other, and it doesn't matter where you sit in the workforce, you've got a critical role to play in making people's lives function.
Yeah, I think that's like an extremely important philosophical thing to reflect upon. I grew up in a house where most of my family were in a trade background as well, and I know that my father used to always comment on the fact that the reason he had to go to work on Christmas was because otherwise people wouldn't be able to catch the train to go and see their families. And I've been reflecting on that a lot in this period, realizing how redundant my skill set is when it comes to immediately solving some of these crises, and how absolutely critical some of those people are instead.
I don't think you should undersell yourself, Daniel. I think it's it's like so many people who've suddenly had to think about the skill set they've got and what do they have to offer in this environment. And we rely on volunteers at Food Bank. Yeah. We used to have 300 corporate volunteers a week coming through our warehouse. Pretty much as soon as this kicked along, we went from 300 to 4 in the first week and to none the next week. So we had to think about, how do we go out there and replace that volunteer workforce with another volunteer workforce? And so I think what you're seeing is people are being very innovative in what they've got to offer in these difficult times. And while there will be people who sadly will be unemployed, I think everybody needs to think a bit outside the square about what can I do? What's the opportunity for me to actually contribute in these circumstances and during this difficult time?
That's a remarkable observation, though, John. I didn't like. What do you think has led to your volunteers dropping off like that? And I guess, like, is that something that everyone who's on the call could help with? What would we do to do that? How would we help?
So, well, our corporate. So a lot of corporate Australia these days have what they call CSR days, so corporate social responsibility days. People use those days through their organisations. They come and volunteer. They'll pick and pack orders for us in our warehouse. That's how we do what we do. You know, in such a cost-effective way, is we have a volunteer workforce that we induct every single day. That just stopped because organisations started early in the piece saying, okay, if it's not necessary for you to do some functions, don't do it. And corporate volunteering was one of those things, which I completely understand. And we sat down weeks before that and predicted this might happen, so we were ready for that. We've reached out to local councils who've stood workers down and said, hey, how about you reallocate some of your workers there? We've had to think about how we do that because 300 volunteers a week is 1,200 over a 4-week period, and we had to think about risk of infection. So we've said to volunteers that are replacing it, you know, we need you to commit to 2 days or 3 days a week, so we reduce that churn and the risk of infection. We've been fortunate. We've managed to get to that point after about a fortnight. We've reached I guess the equilibrium where we've replaced all our corporates with individuals or volunteers from some organisations that have stood workers down, and that's allowed us to keep doing what we're doing. But our days are a lot longer in the warehouse than they were before COVID-19 because demand's increased by 50%, and so you can imagine, you know, the sort of stresses and strains that's putting on our warehouse, but we're managing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I assume, is it something where we can go to your website if we want to help, or is it just... Yeah.
Yep, look, people can go to our website. I'd say right now, which is a pretty extraordinary situation we all find ourselves in, we're actually saying to people who want to volunteer, yes, we'll put you on a wait list, something we've never done before. So again, one of the positives out of this is the fact that instead of having to scramble for volunteers like we were, we're actually at a point where we've got people waitlisted to come and help us, which is, you know, amazing.
Great. I might turn to Elly now as well. So Elly, I think you come at this from a different perspective again, and I'm really interested to see what are the kind of trends that you've been following over the last couple of years, and then how do they kind of intersect with the changes that we've seen during COVID? And I guess, are there any other remarkable observations you've had about these last couple of weeks?
Well, I think the first thing to kind of note when we talk about sort of trends in people's eating behaviours or dietary habits and so on is that it's actually really difficult to measure. And, you know, I wish that thinking about diet and food was as easy as when we ask people, you know, do you smoke? How many, you know, cigarettes would you smoke in a day or a week or so on? It's actually quite easy to measure that, but to actually ask people, what are you eating? How often are you eating it? What combinations are you putting together? You know, for you know, how many days a week? It's actually really, really tricky. And that's why diet is actually one of those really complex areas when we are looking at sort of the impact on health, particularly in terms of chronic disease risk. So, you know, yes, kind of short term, we might be able to see some changes perhaps in people's dietary behaviours, but you know, it's difficult to measure and to quantify, and we also need to have a look, you know, probably over the longer term as well. I mean, I have been really interested to see that a lot of those kind of quite highly processed staples have been flying off the shelves, yet, you know, in a lot of the kind of metropolitan supermarkets, you can still find a lot of fresh food that's quite readily available. But I do think that there's certainly a major gradient in Australia around rural and regional and remote communities, not just in terms of food access and access to healthy food, but also in terms of other kind of health outcomes as well. So there's certainly a big divide that's been happening and growing for a long time between those sort of, you know, two main groups or communities. And I think that you know, some of the research we've done, particularly around food security, suggests that there's kind of 7 main sort of systems or subsystems that actually influence how people can access healthy food or not. And they are things like housing, you know, whether you actually live somewhere where you can cook and prepare food, social protection and income, you know, one of the really good things that has happened because of this crisis has been the increase in New Start, or whatever it's called now. I think it's Job Seeker, I'm not sure. I mean, raising people's income is one of the most powerful things you can do to actually impact their health. Employment's a really important sort of system that influences people's access to healthy food. Education and food literacy, transport. We did some research a few years ago with some Aboriginal communities, and you know, one of the most powerful things you can actually do to improve people's access to food and healthy food is to give them a bus to get on to go and get the food, or to have access to a car. That's just not a reality for particularly people living in, you know, small communities, isolated communities where a supermarket is a really long way away. And then there's kind of two other sort of areas or systems that influence people's access to healthy food: planning, and also the food system or environment more broadly. So do you have a food environment that discounts, you know, unhealthy foods, or does it actually subsidise your sort of healthier foods that you want people to buy more of? At the moment, if you go into any supermarket in Australia, the things that are subsidised quite heavily and the things that are advertised at the end of, you know, the aisle, they're all foods that actually we don't really want people to eat much of on a daily basis. So I'll be really interested to see how people's eating habits do change as a result of this, but the caveat is it's very difficult to measure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think there are some indicators, like you know, the fact that the alcohol sales have increased so dramatically as well. And perhaps you don't actually have an answer to this, but what are the kind of longer term health impacts of being a lot more sedentary? Like, I know we get fat, it's not very pleasant, but are there any particularly unique risks that many of us wouldn't have faced before by living much more sedentary lives and turning to comfort food a little bit more because things are a bit more stressful? Like, what does the consequence of that look like?
Yeah, so the consequences that we're always concerned about are not just in terms of, you know, weight gain and excess weight gain, but also about, you know, your cardiovascular risk profiles as well. And a lot of those kind of risk profiles actually interact with each other, so they're quite difficult to tease out. What we, you know, generally say to people, and this is what you'll find in the Australian dietary guidelines and a lot of dietary guidelines around the world, is that you know, you should be eating a diet that is, you know, minimally processed, fresh food, mostly, you know, lots of fruit and veg, that you should limit your alcohol intake, if drink at all, that you should promote breastfeeding. That's another really important area in terms of promoting healthy food and nutrition, and that you should exercise regularly. Now, what that looks like for each individual can often be quite different, and that's why there's a difference between kind of the population level advice that we give to people versus, you know, talking to individuals and giving them, say, particular kind of nutritional advice, which is what, you know, your dietitians and people like that would do. So yeah, there's kinds of big differences between you know, whether you were talking about Australia as a whole, or, you know, a particular individual and what their preferences might be for certain foods or certain activities or behaviours. And actually, one thing I will just note is, I was looking at this before, but there was a really big piece of research that came out a couple of weeks ago, which has flown under the radar because of COVID. And it was actually looking at the sort of impact on weight gain, you know, from sort of 6 months and 12 months beyond that, in terms of different diets that people follow. And actually it found that there was not really much of a difference at all, and that a lot of people, you know, either didn't experience any kind of weight loss, or they put the weight back on within sort of 12 months or longer. So, you know, that kind of raises a big question about, well, when we say to people, what should you be eating? Good question. What do you want to eat? What do you enjoy? You know, and I think that that's really important in times like COVID. Eat the things that you do enjoy, do the activities that you like. You know, don't try and become a gym junkie overnight with all these kind of, you know, free fitness apps. Do stuff that you enjoy and that gives you pleasure.
That gives me a lot of comfort personally as someone who has consistently failed at embracing those apps. We have a question from Stephanie Odoi, who I might throw to you now.
Sure. Hi, Elly. My question was just in relation to one of the things you touched on before. You said that the kind of consumption, at least from the level of what's being purchased at supermarkets, is increasing with highly processed foods. I was just wondering if you could elaborate as to like what those foods are at the moment and why you think there's kind of been an increase in their demand.
Yeah, good question. I, to be honest, don't know, but I also haven't actually seen sales data. I can only go off what I've sort of observed on, on supermarket shelves. The sorts of foods that I'm talking about are things like, pasta sauces. A lot of those actually we probably wouldn't recommend people generally buy and eat because they've got usually a lot of salt and sugar in them, and we encourage people to sort of make their own. Flour and white sugar and things like that. A lot of those things are really heavily processed types of foods that, yes, we need them to make certain things like, your banana breads that Rebecca Huntley talked about, but actually, in a lot of these cases, we probably don't want people eating lots of banana bread on a regular basis. It's a tricky sort of area, but yeah, definitely the amount of space that is dedicated in supermarkets to sort of more processed, less healthy food products, that's been an ongoing problem and tension, I think, for sort of trying to promote a healthier food system.
Thanks for that. I think I might now go to Natalie Howson as well, who had an interesting question that touches on something that Elly mentioned earlier. Yeah, Natalie, are you there?
Yeah, hi. My question was really back at the very beginning of the conversation when we were talking about the issue of equity in the food supply chain. I was just interested if production is well and truly above what's necessary for our population. What do we need to do to actually shift the equity and distribution of food production?
Yeah, so essentially to cut out all of that food waste you mentioned at the start, Elly. Also, not necessarily to throw it to you, also open to John and Rebecca here as well. I think we might just open up to general questions. So just while actually everyone's thinking about that, I might just do a little side and say, please do pop questions in the side now. We've got sort of 15 minutes to have a much more open conversation. But yeah, talking about food equity and reducing waste and making sure that things we produce get to the people who need it. Do any of you guys have any particular thoughts on that?
So I think for Food Bank, one person's waste is another person's donation from where we sit, and while we don't get all of it, what we saw when suddenly standards were dropped by the retailers was that our donations dropped, which meant our capacity to get food to people who need it was under pressure. One of the things that we're very conscious of, while our primary function is to provide quality food to people in need, we're also very conscious of minimising landfill and those sorts of things. So to give you an idea, less than 1% of everything that comes into our warehouse goes out as landfill. We do everything we can to make sure if it's produce that's no longer fit for human consumption, we work with a number of farmers to make sure that food's going out there to feed stock and those sorts of things. But like I say, one person's waste can be our donations, and I think it's always there's two sides of this equation. It's not to say that there aren't issues around equity and access to food, because there certainly are, but I also think that we kind of give a different perspective on what waste might look like.
Yeah. Are there particular foods that are more wasted than others?
I think what we see, what's interesting, we have we have two jokes in our warehouse. One is that we don't have a supply chain, we have a surprise chain, because you never know what's going to get donated from one day to the next. But the second one is we often see products that come in where someone in marketing's had a brilliant idea about let's mix this, this and this and put it in a drink or put it in a box and try and sell it. And when you end up with anywhere between 100 and 200 pallets of this particular product sitting in the warehouse, you tend to know that the marketing people got it wrong. Look, there's nothing that you could say in absolute terms, But I think, for us, we're always out there looking for more, and in particular, always looking to make sure key staples and quality food is primarily what we're looking for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I might now throw to, we had a question from Liz. Sorry, I've forgotten your surname. There is no surname, that's why I didn't know it, to pose a question. There was a couple of questions in the chat that kind of talked about how to get food to and from regional areas. So, Liz, if you're there, I might get you to ask your question.
Yeah, sure. I think my question's relatively self-explanatory. But I'm just interested in the robustness of the volunteer groups and organisations, particularly in regional areas, who are distributing food that perhaps comes from Food Bank or others. And my example I've given there is, in our main town, the existing sort of food bank, in inverted commas, happens once a month, and they've announced that they're going to shut down until after the pandemic. So, at a time when perhaps it's most needed, it's not available. And obviously other informal mechanisms are emerging and people aren't going without, but I think it exposes, vulnerabilities both for those community members who need support, but also the systems that are already in place, potentially supporting them, but not right now.
So, Liz, I can't speak for Food Bank WA because we're a federated structure, and that we just. But what I can say is what we're looking at in New South Wales is, I talked earlier about Aboriginal Land Councils, ABSEC, also in those areas where we've had some of our charity partners close down, and I think you highlighted that in your earlier question in the chat on the side about the fact that about health. We have about 750 charities we deal with in New South Wales, and we've had about 100 who've made the decision to close for the well-being of their volunteers, because unsurprisingly in a lot of these organisations, they tend to be in that age bracket that's most at risk from COVID-19. So those charities have made a decision to close. What we've started doing in those areas is talking to the Country Women's Association. We've been working with them for probably the last 2 years through drought. We've been delivering drought hampers to those drought-affected communities in New South Wales through the CWA. We've had a conversation also with the Rural Fire Service about some of their sheds potentially becoming hubs for the distribution of food. And if none of those work, we will start to talk to local councils about them becoming hubs for people to access food. We're conscious of the fact that some of these charities might be closed for long periods of time, and there'll be people with need or a greater need in some of those areas. So we're looking at what are the other opportunities with organisations that we've historically worked with, whether it's RFS, and we worked with them very closely throughout the bushfire season in New South Wales this year, whether it's the CWA with drought, or whether we start to say to local council, okay, you guys have got a responsibility to step in and fill this gap, at least in the short term. Yeah.
I might now go to Serena, who has a really interesting question too. If you're there, Serena.
Yeah, I'm here. So I guess this question's for the panel, but maybe also for people in the audience. I'm a researcher, and there's been lots of calls and some funding put out for research into social and community resilience because of the COVID-19 crisis. But I'd like to hear what do we actually need to know at this stage about the food system and social resilience. I mean, that's a very, very broad category. In particular, I'm personally interested in rural and regional Australia. What are the big unknowns? And if research is going to get funded at this time, what actual questions we should be asking and looking into?
Yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that? Yeah. I think that I might extend that with another question. I know that Natalie Howson posed a question to you about there's clearly some problems here. Like what are some of the proposals we can take to address things? Natalie, if you're on the line, you can pose that yourself. Although I feel like I may have just stolen your thunder.
Yeah, I'm just, I'm really interested in the system-related questions about why we're in this situation. While I appreciate that the work that charities like Food Bank do is really important, it just seems to me to be more than bizarre that we're in a situation where people are unable to access food when there's so much produced. And, you know, my brother told me there was a run on Bunnings in relation to seedlings and gardening equipment. I can't get diggers to fill my own, you know, my own orders for seeds and so on. So people are currently really looking at growing their own and getting into gardening. Seems like an opportunity. And I was wondering if there are examples of local communities that are doing something about shoring up food security for their own citizens.
Yeah, so on that, actually, Rebecca, I think there's another question that's very similar to this that I might put to you, and then I'll come back to Elly, which is like, have you done any research on increased uptake around local food growing? And I guess that links into Natalie's question about like, how can we make our food system more secure by growing stuff locally?
Yeah, look, I think we have to recognise that in order to grow your own food, you have to have the space, the skill, and the time. And so, you know, you're already embedding in that a certain degree of socioeconomic privilege, and you've always got to live in an area which is conducive to be able to grow stuff outdoors, unless you're you know, capable of creating a greenhouse. It's hard.
It's very noisy while I'm on the chat show. I've been asking.
It's a bit of a niche. It's a rare privilege to think that you can bake your own bread from scratch and grow things in your own home. And of course, it also depends on how many people you are you're needing to cater for and provide for. And so, as some of the callers already on this line would know, that, for example, if you're in a multi-generational household, or if you're in a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander household where people come and go for different reasons, and the scope of the family might contract and shrink at different times, then the kind of idea that you can grow your own food from seedlings from Bunnings is a bit of a middle class pipe dream.
Yeah, I think there's a reason we moved away from having an agrarian economy. You can't run a farm and also have a successful career. Although, you know, I'm sure you could, Rebecca.
No, if you're a Deliveroo driver, you know, to what extent are you going to have the time to grow your own food at home? You know, you're much more likely to eat whatever the restaurant's about to chuck out. So I'm not discouraging people from being able to work out how difficult it is actually to grow your own food, but you just have to have so much time and capacity to be able to do that, to provide the kind of the variety that people need. So I encourage people, if they can do it, to do it. But the larger question is about how we create the conditions for the people that grow our food, transport it from where it's grown to where it's going to be consumed, and make that accessible to people, including people who don't have a car to drive to the place to get it, you know. So it is really about production, distribution and consumption, and equity around that. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I was merely making a joke about how you managed to pull off way more than most other people can in their lives. I might now go to Elly as well, because I think the essence of that question was had another element, which is what can we do to improve the kind of food security and health issues? Like, what are some actionable things we can do?
Yeah, so some research that we did about 2 or 3 years ago at the Prevention Centre where I work for, we, and I should sort of preface this by saying that our research we do in partnership with policymakers and government agencies. So that's really important in terms of if you're trying to think about how do we do research that is going to be really relevant for policymakers to actually enact and follow through with. But one piece of research we did was around if the GST were to be expanded to fresh food, what would that mean for the affordability of healthy and fresh food in people's diets and in Australian households? And we were able to provide that data and information and that modelling to the federal government to really argue very strongly against the GST being expanded. And I guess one of the things that we should be thinking about in terms of the sort of budget environment that we're facing federally is we need to be really quite firm, I think, as advocates, as researchers, as people who are passionate about this issue, that, you know, increasing the GST and then applying it to something like fresh food would have really quite massive detrimental effects on the diets of Australians and the ability for Australian households to access healthy and nutritious food. So I think that's one really clear action that we can say, you know, we've already actually got a subsidy on fresh food in Australia. It's because the GST hasn't been applied. I think we need to work really hard to make sure that whatever happens down the track, that the GST is not applied to fresh food, or we will see, you know, we will see worsening kind of health inequalities in this space.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Peter Lewis, I might call on you now as well. Just because you had a really interesting question around how social distancing might impact the places where we buy our food.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the great discussion, everyone. It's been great listening to this while sort of having the experience of being the at-home person. Our growers market has closed down. I know it's also Rebecca's growers market, and it's been the lifeblood of our community, and a lot of the people that operate there, their livelihoods are locked in and they're still producing the fruit. And one of the things that's concerning me with their demise is whether we are just going to see a reconcentration of power back to the big supermarket chains who have a whole bunch of different, you know, power relationships with providers. And so the application of social distancing has had a really big effect on these, you know, the organic markets and those sorts of things. So don't know the answer, but, you know, what do you guys reckon?
Do you have any idea why that is?
It was mainly because of the distancing, that there was a sense that the authorities shut them down because, you know, ours is done at the local primary school.
Yeah.
They were trying to space people out for a couple of weeks.
That's really interesting because in the Hawkesbury, like the Richmond markets are still on. Like the food markets, not the other, but the food markets are still running. So I just see someone's jumped in and said the markets in Northern Rivers are still on as well. That's why I'm really intrigued, because it's been one of those things that actually I've had the reverse experience, because it's somewhere people are going because they can A, get it, and B, it's really good quality stuff. So it's interesting.
I live in the inner city as well, and right near Carriage Works, and those markets haven't been running either.
Okay. There's an extension of that too to smaller providers of, let's say, prepared foods, is in order for their industrial processes to work, they've had to lay off staff and re-manage their manufacturing process to encourage social distancing. So kind of small bakeries that normally provide to their, you know, to provide to their retail stores, but also broadly, have just had to, because of social distancing, cut back on their supply. So it's created an enormous amount of pressure on even the ones that have kept going about what they're actually able to produce, because in order to space workers out in a particular kind of way.
The interesting thing for us is, you know, on the back of all this and you know, restaurants not opening and those and the like, is we've had huge donations from fish farms of fish.
Right.
You know, again, which is the flip side of they can't get their fish into the Chinese restaurants where we see them swimming around in the fish tanks and so on. And I mean, literally hundreds of kilos of fish that we've had filleted and frozen and the like that we would never have got access to, simply because if they didn't give it to us, they were just going to kill it and dig a hole and shove it in the ground. So there's some positives coming out of, you know, the difficult circumstances as well. And it means for us, we've got people who are getting access to great fresh fish. You know, it's literally killed, frozen, and, you know, going out the door of our place, you know, within 3 or 4 days. And so I think it's those people also thinking about, okay, what's another avenue that I can get my produce or whatever it is out to people and actually get it to people in need.
I think one, we're getting very close to the end now, so I might pose a question and we might call maybe one more from the group. But one thing that I was really keen to hear from you all about and didn't want to leave without talking about is this an interesting opportunity to think about how we can adapt and change some of the things that we do grow and the different consumables that we use in our products. For example, like could we potentially start using kangaroo grass instead of imported barley when it comes to brewing beer? Like, what are things that we can draw from kind of Indigenous and First Nations people farming and agricultural processes and adapt into our food production processes now to compensate for the gaps we've been filling with imported stuff? If you have any thoughts on that, you may not.
I think the combination of something like this plus the long-term implications of climate change are going to bring about over time a shift in our diets, perhaps not as quickly as possible, but quickly as necessary. But I think climate change is going to make more of an impact than, let's say, something like COVID on those kinds of questions. I mean, there are, as much as there has been a resurgent interest in Indigenous food production because of things like Dark Emu and also, for other people that are doing that work, a lot more support for those industries is required, a lot more selling into consumers around that. There are whole massive questions about water management, water resource management and so forth that comes with that. But I think that we are starting to see slowly and surely a kind of rethinking of our diet because of the implications of climate change. And I think we'll only see that continue over the next 10 years.
Yeah, awesome, thank you. Tanya Stoll has just posted a really interesting and good link in the chat as well. So I encourage you all to have a look at that. And I guess actually I will call one last question, which is Joswek, I think. I'm possibly mispronouncing that, I'm so sorry, but I just saw you pop up a question about food sovereignty. If you can step forward, we might get you to pose that question to the panel. Just quickly. All right. Oh, are you there?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Daniel. My question is just, so Australia doesn't really have a strong right to food or a food sovereignty movement that exists in a lot of countries, such as in the countries of South America or Canada. So the current circumstances, what sort of consequences do you perceive the impacts on the current right to food sovereignty movements in Australia? And after this is over, is there some sort of opportunity to build a national food policy looking at sustainable food growing, equitable, affordable, just access to food, and building a much more robust, healthy food policy in Australia than the current food regime?
Can I jump in and say that there was a food policy that was being developed under the Rudd-Gillard government? I'm not sure what's happened to that policy, but that was a real kind of opportunity to have a lot of these things kind of looked at from a kind of national and federal perspective with sort of flow-on actions as well. So I think there's obviously still scope for that. I know people have put in the chat that we've also got a food sovereignty alliance here, and we've got great people like Dr. Alana Mann, who's on the call as well. She's been doing fantastic research around food sovereignty in Australia and with particular communities as well. So I would definitely encourage you to check out her work too.
And if I can just jump in and say, I think we've all been pretty positive throughout this thing, which has been nice. But there are a number of committees that are up and running at a federal level already around food security, and surprisingly being run through Peter Dutton's agency and Border Force, with the supermarkets, with Food Bank on it as well, that is looking at this. Now, I'm not, at this stage, it's not to the extent that you've talked about, but I would be hopeful that on the back of this, there are opportunities for those committees to continue, when we get to the other side of the bridge, as everyone talks about, to actually think more long-term about some of those issues.
Awesome. In which case, I might just begin to wrap up. But before I do, one thing I like to end these conversations on, even though, as John mentioned, this has actually been slightly more positive than some of the conversations we've had, is just to ask the three of you, like, what is something that you felt really glad to see this week? If it's about food, all the better, but even if it's not, just something that has genuinely brought a smile to your face this week. While you have a moment to think about what that might be, I just want to also say thank you all for joining us. I think it's been a really, really, really interesting conversation, and that includes both the speakers and you, everyone who has joined us from home. I think we've had a really good conversation today with lots of questions. Sometimes these concepts are so big that folk feel a little bit overwhelmed and don't participate, but I think it's a really good participation today, so thank you so much. We will also be sending around a bit of a feedback questionnaire after today's session, so please do give us your thoughts in that. And we've tried to make it as simple as humanly possible, and it does go into improving how we approach these sessions each day and each week. And next week too, I just kind of wanted to give you a bit of a highlight as to what we'll be talking about then. So on Monday, we're going to be talking about housing and impacts on housing of the pandemic, with some really interesting speakers who've been doing a lot of work on homelessness, on rental security and opportunity and things like that. So that's going to be really interesting. Then we've got, as usual, our political geek fest, as Peter likes to call it, with Catherine Murphy and Peter Lewis running us through the most recent findings from the Essential Report. Before our Wednesday, where we have Emma Dawson from Per Capita, a great think tank, that is going to be talking with Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers about some of the hard choices we will be probably needing to make over the next a couple of months. So jump on to australianhome.com.au and you can sign up for any of those events. But just before we do go, I'm going to come back to each of the speakers and say, what is the thing that has made you feel happy this week?
So this is trite, but I've heard Tim Costello say it's okay, and it's a week where we've seen the best and the worst in people. I'll just share quickly a story. We had someone ring up yesterday, I think it was, our office, offering to donate $5,000 because he's retired, he'd booked a holiday to Japan, and he wasn't going to get to go to Japan, and he rang and said, I want to donate the money to Food Bank. So, I mean, it made me smile for two reasons. I mean, one, obviously, what we can do with that amount of money, but secondly, just how generous people are being in these really trying times and dealing with the disappointment of not going to Japan and still looking for a way to do something great made me smile.
That's extraordinary. Yeah. Rebecca, have you got anything?
I was very happy to hear that Robbo's still able to run the warehouse without corporates. So, but it made me also think, and you get this from social media, particularly from us small businesses, being incredibly creative and working hard about how to keep their people employed, how to keep still delivering a service, remaining connected to the community. And, this kind of idea that Australians always want a handout is not true. I think that people are prepared to put in that creative work to get to a certain point, which is one of the many reasons why government needs to support them ongoing in being able to do that. So I haven't seen an enormous amount of complacency from businesses necessarily, especially small business, about what they can do. So that's been very encouraging.
What about you, Elly?
I'm going to go with a very technical kind of public health thing that made me very happy this week. Just recently, the government has announced that they're sending out some rapid COVID testing kits for Aboriginal communities, remote Aboriginal communities. That's been the one kind of thing that a lot of health workers and public health people have been really worried about, is COVID hitting our really vulnerable populations, particularly in isolated areas. I'm really happy about that. I think it's a great decision, and I think it's also a really good reminder of the things that we need to do as a society and as civil society advocates and actors. We need to make sure that First Nations people are at the front and centre of all of that as well, not just food, but also health, climate change responses and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And my closing one was getting to spend my Friday afternoon with you all. As contrived as that is, it's been really wonderful. So with that, thank you so much. Let's give our speakers an applause and then have a wonderful weekend. Thanks, everyone.